Okay, here we go. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks for joining us once more on the Image Review Live. This is kind of a special Image Review Live. We have today a guest reviewer with us. As you know, you typically is Jaclyn and I doing these, but this time around I have my friend David Swindler. David and I just came back literally just a few days ago from Antarctica, where we were out there for 20 something days, long voyage. We went to South Georgia and then the Antarctic Peninsula. And although we had some challenging weather, we still had a lot of fun, didn't we?
Well, we definitely did, and the times we did to get to go out, it was just almost epic
Yeah.
with the images we were able to capture, and we really got to capitalize on some unique conditions. I thought so. I was really happy, with the set of images we were able to get by the end of the workshop. And yeah, sometimes the weather is challenging, and plan things don't always go according to plan, but that's the way we roll as photographers. We go, we roll with the punches, and we still find good ways to make quality images.
Yeah, I mean it was, I've been down that way, a bunch of times. Mostly to the Antarctic Peninsula. This was my first time going to South Georgia, which was for me, one of the top places I wanted to get to. So, and we did. We were able to make a couple really nice landings. Not as many as we had hoped, but again, we were hampered by weather. We had lots of very strong winds and some pretty harrowing crossings going across from the Falkland Islands to South Georgia, and then from South Georgia to the Antarctic Peninsula. And even, crossing the Drake, all things considered, wasn't as bad as some of the previous crossings that we did, right?
Oh, I thought the Drake seemed pretty smooth and easy by comparison.
Yeah, which is saying a lot. By the way, folks, we also have Jaclyn with us. You don't see her on video, but she is by voice behind the scenes, and she is also checking out or responding to the comment section on the chat. You want to say hi, Jaclyn? You want to just you can speak. Hold on, I can't hear you. I wonder why it's going on. Why are you muted? Hold on. Why are you muted? That is weird. So I'm going to add just guest number 2. Okay. Try speaking now. See if you're. Nope, I still cannot hear you. That is interesting. So yeah, never mind. I guess we can't get Jaclyn on. I'm not sure why that is, why she wasn't on. We were just talking with her a few minutes ago, so everything looked good until we pressed the go live button. So I wonder why that is. I'm looking here at my settings to see if there's anything that. No, I mean, yeah, the volume is. Just make sure you're not muted on your side, Jaclyn. It doesn't. On our side, it looks like you're. I don't know. Anyways, so why don't we get started with the review, with image review? We have images from what? How many people? I think is 11 people. We have a bunch of images to go through, and again, as we're going to do, as we typically do, we go this time around in alphabetical order. Last time we did it, if I remember correctly, we went in reverse alphabetical order. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, and we're going to hit one image per person until we kind of go back around and circle back around and maybe be able to do the second image that every person submitted. But why don't we get started, David?
All right, sounds great.
So this is our first image, and this was actually from Arlene Courtney. Arlene is a client that's been with me on a bunch of different trips. I think you've met Arlene before, right, David?
I think so.
She was in
Yeah,
Yellowstone. She's been in Yellowstone in
Costa-
Costa Rica, maybe on one of the trips that you were on as well. I can't remember.
yeah.
And Arlene was just in Madagascar. She was texting me just before she went to Madagascar, and she apparently had a great time. And this is one of the images she made from that trip of a dancing sifaka. Um, pretty interesting pose here. And this is one of the things that sifakas are known for when they're actually crossing, going from one tree to another. They actually do this on their hind legs, and they look like they're dancing as they jump across from one tree to the other in Madagascar. So I'm looking for. I'm headed out to Madagascar this coming year in 2023 to do some scouting for workshops in 2024. So I'm actually looking forward to seeing these. So what are your thoughts, David?
This is obviously a very great action capture. I love the mid-air pose. The legs are separated. There's no collision with the tail, and the arms are both out. So you see all the appendages. It really gives you the feeling that the animal is suspended in midair, as it's kind of jumping. One thing that I would have liked to have seen is to have the head kind of facing me rather than looking away. Because, when it's looking away, it makes it a little harder for the viewer to kind of engage with that image. What do you think, Juan?
No, I agree. One of the, I mean, the nice thing here is at least it's looking perpendicular to us, right? So it's at 90 degrees from us. So at least we can view the eye, but certainly being able to make that eye connection makes a big difference. So, one of the rules that I always tell people is once a subject starts moving away from you or looking away from you, that's the time when you stop pressing the shutter in most cases, not always, but in most cases. So yeah, I think it would have been, much more effective to have that subject looking straight at us would have been perfect. But even looking at, 45 degrees away from us versus the 90 degrees would have been a little bit better. But I love the comments that you made about all the appendages in different positions and whatnot. That give you a good sense of shape and dimension to our subject. We can see that little bit of dirt being kicked off down here at the bottom as it just jumps from on one foot to the other. The other comment that I would make is that you see how the sifaka is right in the middle of the frame. I would like to see it, less middle of the frame and more, one of the cardinal rules that we talk about with wildlife photography is to provide more room in front of your subject than behind the subject. And we do have a little bit more room here in front of the subject, but I still would like to see maybe a little less room in the back and more in the front.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would also say, it's easy to look at stuff now and say, coulda, woulda, shoulda. But, an image like this would also be more impactful had it been shot from a lower angle. Because then it would really look like it's more like in the air rather than kind of looking more down on the subject. And also, this image was shot at ISO 10,000. I know it's kind of a dark forest. You're trying to get a fast shutter speed at f5.6. So there's not a lot of depth of field here. And, if you look carefully, you can see like the paws are sharp, but the head is not. And so, I'd work on doing a little selective sharpening, on the face and also doing a bit of noise reduction, especially on the flat tonal areas in the background.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're right that this is shot at 10,000 ISO, which is remarkable. Think about what 10,000 ISO would have looked like 5 years ago, even, right? It's just incredible that we can see so much, such a clean image at 10,000 ISO. So, I mean, this is a great example as to why you should never shy away from pushing that ISO up, because she needed to have that shutter speed, 1600th of a second, in order to freeze that motion. Yes, I would have liked to have seen a little bit deeper depth of field so that you're right, your face would be a lot sharper. But I think that getting that shutter speed up high was very crucial in trying to get this shot nice and sharp, nice and frozen in midair with not a lot of motion. You can see a little bit of motion on the tail here, but that's okay. I think that adding that little bit of motion blur can actually, make a difference in the image. The other thing that I noticed here that I really like is that, you mentioned that getting lower would have been better, and I agree with you. Getting lower would have made it, made the subject look bigger in the frame or more impressive, and also give you that sense of a higher jump. But at the very least, she is shooting at eye level. So, this is, sifakas are not that tall. They're, between 2 to 3 feet tall. So, when you're shooting them, the tendency is to shoot from a standing position, shooting down at them, and that you would have lost a lot. At least shooting here at eye level, really allows you to see a subject in its true form. getting a
Yeah.
little bit lower would have been a little bit better, but I think, Arlene, you did pretty good.
Yep, I agree. It's a really great shot. And yeah, it's crazy how many good wildlife images can be taken while almost lying on the ground.
Yeah, I know, and I love this. I mean, I photographed alpacas before when I lived in North Carolina. The largest number of lemurs in the world outside of Madagascar are in a research facility at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And when I lived in North Carolina, I used to go to that facility. So I photographed alpacas in the past, but in the U.S., not in Madagascar. So it's pretty cool, pretty special to see these guys jumping around like that. It's really neat. So I'm glad you had a great time, Arlene, and I hope that these comments prove useful to you. Okay, let's look at the next one. This one is from Charles Taylor. What do you think, David?
Okay, so I'm actually just getting that pulled up here. Give me a second.
Yeah, so this looks like some basalt or some lava um, hills. I'm not sure exactly where this was. We don't have a lot of information about this. Charles, if you're watching, why don't you post in the chat a little bit about the information about the image? And while David brings it up, did you have it up already?
Yep, so I have it up now. So, okay, so I'm just taking a look here. I'm trying to see, this was shot at 19 millimeters on a 12 to 24 millimeter lens. And so, I like the clouds here, and I love the inclusion of that little island because it gives some nice foreground anchoring. As far as the balance of the image goes, I feel like it's a little bit heavy on that left side because the mountain is just so dominant, and also that little island is kind of more left justified as well. And so, compositionally, we may play around, with maybe shifting the crop over or something like that to kind of help ease some of that imbalance that we kind of feel. But if I had been in the field here, and I don't know what it looked like in front of this island, if it would even be possible or not, but I love reflections and I love to see full reflections. I don't like it when they're cut off. And so, yeah, you had the wide angle capability with this lens to possibly have shot this at like 12 millimeters, maybe gotten down a little bit lower, maybe gotten the full reflection in that shot. For me, that would have really made that more of a home run type image. What do you think, Juan?
Yeah, so Charles actually responded. He said he shot this at Tombstone Territorial Park in the Yukon Territory in Canada.
Ooh, very.
I think,
I'm jealous. I
yeah,
want to
this
go
is
there.
a beautiful area, absolutely gorgeous. I love the reflection of the water. I love the inclusion of that green in the foreground. Um, I think that one of the issues that I have with the image is that we do have this amazing, beautiful, formation back here, geological formation, and this green in the foreground. But we include so much on the right hand side that I think our eye is being it's getting lost as we look through this image, especially when we have all these clouds on the right hand side that are so bright. Um, so maybe or perhaps I would focus more on the parts that are interesting in this image. The most interesting part of the image, which to me are this volcanic formation in the foreground and this green including the reflection. So maybe doing this, I'm gonna do a quick crop here just to get an idea. Doing this as a vertical and just focusing on, I mean, I would probably need to move a little bit also, probably move a little bit to the right to include that greenery more on the foreground and include maybe some of that reflection at the bottom, so that I'm providing less room for my viewer's eye to wander around trying to figure out what it is I'm looking at. I want to focus my viewer's attention onto the scene. And I think this is the stronger part of the image. Again, I think the composition, I would do it a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more to the right, so that these green are more to the left side and I can focus more on the most interesting part of this mountain.
Yeah, and if I was in the field, what I would have tried to do is move my body over a little more to the left, because what that would do is it would push the green island to the right, and it would help balance the mountain's dominance on the left side, kind of give that natural yin and yang, to each side of the image. The other thing that you have to be really careful of with reflections is that they have to be shot level to the horizon. And if they're not, it's kind of everybody can tell. And so right here you can see there's significant misalignment, from the source to the reflection as far as drawing a vertical line. And so I always really make sure that I keep that vertical line nice and straight, from the tip of the mountain peak to the tip of the reflection in the lake.
Very cool. Okay. Let's look at the next image by David Recht. And David was with us in Antarctica. So, not surprisingly, he submitted a couple images from that trip. And these are Adelie penguins, which we went to one colony of Adelie penguins on. Was this on the Orkneys? Is that where we did Adelie penguins, or was it on South Georgia? I can't remember.
Would have been the Orkneys.
This is the Orkneys, right? That's when we went to the Orkney Islands, which is interesting. It's a location where not very many people go to. So we kind of felt a little bit privileged that we got to go to the Orkneys, which are just south of South Georgia. Kind of very different in different locations that most people don't go to. And I do like the interaction between these two penguins. The fact that they're kind of reaching out to each other, and the Adelies are considered to be probably the cutest of the penguins because they do have these beautiful eyes. That eye ring that's white that really highlights them. In most of the penguins, the eye is black against black feathers, so it's hard to see the eyes themselves. And that's the great thing about the Adelies. Adelies are actually really small as well, which are kind of make them even that much cuter. But I do love the interaction between these two, and I love the fact that he's got this foreground, these rocks in the foreground with some ice and snow coming down, kind of giving you a great sense of location. One of the challenges with these guys, though, is, and this is something that David and I were talking earlier before we got on, is penguins are kind of dirty animals. They're dirty creatures. They're hanging out in these rookeries that are just full of mud and poop and all sorts of stuff. So when they're hanging out in the rookeries, they get covered in dirt. And that's part of the scene. That's part of what you're seeing, that part of where they are. So it's kind of a neat thing to include in the frame. But from a, fine art perspective, not many people would want to print this and put it big on their wall when the animals are covered in mud and in poop. So that's just something to consider. But I love the interaction between these two. I love the fact that we can see both wings on these guys. This is one question that kept coming up by other workshop participants. What happens if you only have one wing coming out? Does it look weird or whatnot? And I think in this situation, because you have both penguins, you can see one with both wings coming out. Having one to the with just one wing showing is actually neat because it gives you a different perspective and different view on them. David, what do you think about this white space at the top?
I think for me, it actually works. Looking at this just a little bit more, I would say, this is cropped in, I can tell, because it's only
Yes.
like 3,700 pixels or so on both ends. So I might like to see a little bit more space on the left and right sides,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even just a little bit more white space on the top, just to kind of give a better sense of place. So that's just me. But you could also crop this as a square too and get a perfectly great image that's focusing solely on that awesome interaction between the two penguins.
Yeah, I wonder, the obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. It's oftentimes, it's hard to find two penguins in isolation because they're usually either, within amongst of other penguins. So there's a chance that there's a penguin just off to the left or just off to the right on this image that we're not seeing, that was cropped out, whether in post or while you were there. So, I would like to see this also. I think it would actually work very nicely depending on how much space you have as a more panoramic image as well, giving me a bigger sense of place by cropping down at the bottom and giving more space on the left and on the right. I think that both a vertical and a horizontal in this particular image, could work very well. I think it's just a matter of taste. I think I'd like to see, in addition to what you mentioned earlier on the left and the right, I'd like to see maybe a tiny bit more at the bottom. The area where this is cropped down here, I don't know what else is there, but I maybe like to see a tiny bit more at the bottom, so to have more snow at the bottom to kind of ground the image as well. And David
Yeah.
just commented there was one to the left, but there's a little bit more space. So, and he's asking, are there tips for enhancing the gray skies we were seeing? So, what do you think,
Well,
David? Do you want to tackle that?
I think with this image, you could maybe add a little more contrast just to make it
Mm-hmm.
pop more. It feels a little flat to me, but here we're not really seeing any skies. And so, as long as the snow looks white, then I feel like it looks correct. So that's the main thing with these grayish skies is I like my snow to still have that brilliant look to it, not kind of a dingy gray or too much of a bluish tint. And so, yeah, I think the whites maybe we could push those a little bit more, and also maybe just a little bit more deepening of the blacks would help just give that a little more pop. The other thing too that I would point out here is that it was snowing at the time this image was taken, so we have some out of focus snowflakes right on the two faces that we'd want to definitely try to clean up with some like content aware fill or patch tool. And you can also see some of that also up above, in the white space.
Up here.
And so if you were to do like a print of this or something, those spots really become obvious.
Yeah, but I agree. I think that you can push those whites a little more and maybe remove a little bit of that blue cast that's on them. I think that there's a little bit of room for doing that and make the image, pop out a little bit more, make it more brilliant, make that snow even whiter than what you're seeing there. I think you have some more room to push it without losing detail. So I would definitely encourage you to do that. Okay. So this is David Stern with this great horned owl. Amazing, amazing takeoff uh, pose. I love the fact that we can see every single one of these talons. Absolutely gorgeous. We can see that one eye that's in there, and these wings spread out. We see a tiny, tiny bit of motion blur on the edge of these feathers, which I love. I love having that motion blur. Everything else is tack sharp, but that motion, um, we don't have the information on how this image was taken, but just having that tiny bit of motion blur on the wingtips, I absolutely love. I know some people like to have them completely sharp, but I like to have that tiny bit of motion blur. The one thing, David, that I would do um, is I would brighten up that eye. See how that eye is dark? What happens with a lot of these birds of prey, these raptors, is they have pretty pronounced brows. And those brows are there to protect the eye from the sun, from sunshine. But what it also does, it creates kind of a shadow on those eyes. So I would bring in a little bit more light into those eyes. So and that's easy to do with an adjustment brush. Just, do it in on the eye and adjust your exposure, maybe a little bit of saturation and maybe a little bit of contrast in there to bring out that eye and make it a little bit more. You got to be careful not to overdo it because you can make it too bright and then it doesn't look natural.
Yeah.
What do you think, David?
And that will really make it a standout image, if that kind of just brighten those yellows of the eye without
Mm-hmm.
brightening so much blacks. Then it'll have that nicer contrast to it. But yeah, as Juan said, it's really easy to do too much, and then, of course, it's gonna look like it has devil eyes, which nobody ever wants. But I love the composition. I love how you frame that. The one thing I would just caution you on is, at least from what I'm seeing here, it looks like it's a bit over sharpened, and I'm kind of seeing a bunch of artifacts probably coming from topaz. And so you just want to be really careful how much you sharpen and post because it's easy to overdo it.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that too. It just seems a little bit over sharpened in this area. So you want to maybe dial it down a little bit. And sometimes what happens when you over sharpen, you're starting to, you notice a very faint halo around here as well. So you probably want to be on the lookout for that. But just a amazing, amazing image. Very beautiful shot. Nicely composed. I love these clouds in the background. It adds a lot to that scene, and the way that you framed it, works very, very nicely. Great job.
Yeah, and I would also just be careful too on that wing on the left side of the image. You can kind of see there's a space between two feathers where the sky looks a lot brighter.
Right here.
So
Yeah.
it looks like maybe there is a subject selection being done that wasn't quite accurate. And so I'd watch for little things like that too,
Yeah.
just to make sure it looks good throughout.
Yeah, and this would really be something you'd notice easily if you printed this. So yeah, that's definitely something you want to keep an eye out on. Very cool. Okay. Let's take a look at from Jim. So Jim was also in Antarctica with us, and he provided us a before and after, which is great. We love when people do that, sending a before. He sent us here a raw file of this sequence of Gen 2 penguins as they're porpoising. And then he sent us, in addition to that, he sent us his processed image. And you can see, I mean, look at the difference between these two. He basically zoomed in on these guys right here in the middle, where we can see this water splashing going up, these penguins with their mouth open as they're taking a breath coming out of the water. And this is why these guys porpoise, is to actually take a breath as they're coming up. I'm surprised he's only shooting of 1/500th of a second, and that water came out really nice. I'm surprised by that. Typically, you want a little faster shutter speed to freeze that water. So good for you, Jim. I think it looks like you did a great job, and I like the post processing that you did. Really brought out the highlights, give us a little bit of contrast, and really brought out some detail on our subjects. And I love the crop that you did with all this water in the foreground, giving us kind of a sense of place and a sense of motion. Makes the image very dynamic.
Yeah, nice job there, Jim. I agree with what Juan said. One thing that kind of catches my eye a little bit is it looks to me like they're kind of swimming downhill. You kind of see
Mm.
that one?
Yeah, I do. I do.
And so, with all those pixels you have to play with, you can certainly throw in a rotational crop there that could eliminate some of that downhill bias to the image.
I think I went a little too far, but something along those lines. Let's see.
Yeah.
Um, Come on. Let's see if I can. Oh, no. And I think that looks a little better because you see how these beaks look a little more like horizontal than they did before. So, and these sort of ripples also. This is one of the clues that you can take a look at when you're looking at an image. See how these ripples are nice and straight now, whereas
Yep.
before they were kind of at an angle.
hmm Yeah, but nicely done there, Jim.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful shot. So yeah, so to keep an eye out, sometimes we don't notice these things, but subconsciously we do pick up on some of those clues. I've seen that in many cases where actually people will do a crop on a lake scene, for example, and they, when you have a receding shoreline, and they'll try to level that receding shoreline, and you look at it, it looks weird, and you're not sure why, until you start paying attention to the trees in the background, and you notice that the trees are kind of slanted. So it's oftentimes tricky when you're looking at, especially a shoreline. Make sure that you don't find any other elements in your scene that will give you a hint as to when an image is level or not. This one would be pretty easy to miss because these are very subtle things in here, but that gives you that little sense of whether you are level or not. Just something to look at. Those tiny little details make a difference. So this is Joanna Hopkins. And this looks like that she put in here. No, she did not put in location or whatnot. But if I had to guess, this is Italy, maybe? So what do you think? What are your thoughts, David?
I think so. It kind of looks, yeah, it looks like Italy to me. You can kind of see that domed cathedral in the
Right,
background there.
back here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think I like this shot. I think that I do see a lot of negative space that doesn't really add a lot to the scene to me. I like the skies. I like to see the sky maybe brought out a little bit more to add to the scene. But all this water in the foreground is not doing that much for me. I do understand, what you may be trying to convey a feeling here of, kind of this passage through these, large canals. Um, but I want to focus my viewers' attention onto what's important in the scene. And I think that all this water in the foreground doesn't necessarily add anything to the scene that's all that important. So, maybe focusing more on the part that's more important. Maybe making this, instead of a vertical, more of a horizontal, or maybe even a square crop. The sky is a little bit more interesting. We have some interesting cloud formations there, so I wouldn't necessarily, get rid of it all. I'm not saying also get rid of all the water, but I would focus in more on the part of that's most important in the scene, which is, the bridge and the reflection in the water and the silhouette of that skyline.
Yeah, and I agree. With like a landscape type image, you really have to have a strong foreground, midground, and a background for it to work. And just a pretty sky doesn't always cut it.
Hmm.
And so I agree. Just there probably could have been a different angle that this could have been shot at. Maybe having the bridge, having maybe walking closer to that bridge, getting it more at an angle, having it kind of lead the viewer's eye into the frame, and getting a bit less sky in there and getting more of the city and the foreground interest. I think would make it a stronger shot. Now this was shot with an iPhone, and so um, you don't have a lot of post processing margin, with iPhone shots, especially in dimmer light. Um, but I think just working on that composition, is really key because if you don't have good composition, then you really can't do much in post to fix that.
Okay, so let's take an image from Ken. And then Ken was in Costa Rica with us, where he made this image of flying macaws. Just absolutely gorgeous image, beautiful, beautiful macaws. So why don't you start on this one?
Yeah, so I love the colors in this. How the macaws stand out so nicely from that background. And getting the macaws in flight is not easy because they can just take off without any warning, and all of a sudden you're like fumbling around trying to find them in your viewfinder. And so kudos to Ken for being able to capture those great bird in flight moments. And also, I like that the birds have separation. And when you're shooting this fast action scene, you just gotta take tons of shots and then hope and pray that a wing isn't covering the other bird's head, and vice versa. And he's able to do that very well. Obviously, you don't you can't control the scene. You can't say, "Hey, bird A, you need to fly faster than bird B," or something like that. In an ideal world, I would have liked to have seen a little more separation between those two birds, but of course,
Hmm.
you don't have any control over that. Just the fact that we don't have collisions between them, that's saying a lot. And I like that the macaws are looking at you. I like that you can see the out of focus of palm fronds in the background. For me, what might make it even a little stronger is you could play around with some crops too that maybe will crop it in just a little bit. You
Yeah.
don't, maybe not a lot, but just a little bit. And that's almost about the only thing I might suggest. They look nice and sharp, tack sharp actually. In the background is noise free and really creamy. It's just a really wonderful image overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think these macaws are so spectacular. And like David said, these are not easy to photograph. They fly so fast. Even though they're large birds, they fly incredibly fast for their size. And they're just so spectacular. And when you get two of them flying together and you're able to get poses like this with very little collisions, that's pretty remarkable. So you did a great job capturing this. But I agree with David. I think that the way you had it before, the our main subjects are kind of small in the frame. You have all this space over here, which is interesting and nice. You got this really blurry out of background, in the bokeh, but I think you could zoom in some and crop in some and still get the feeling of place. You still get that beautiful coconut palm in the background, while still focusing in on our birds. Look how much closer. I mean, that's probably not, want to give myself a little bit more room on the back. But see how much closer we are to these birds, and we get to see much more detail, these amazing color on these birds. So I think that just cropping in just a little bit more, I think is going to make the image that much more effective. You can see how we can still see the hint of that coconut palm in the background and this foliage, but we get to see a lot more of our birds, which is what we want our viewers to see. We want our viewers to focus on those birds. So absolutely
Yeah.
very nicely done. I love this image, and I want to see here real quick what settings he used. 2,000ths of a second, I have 4. That's why he's got that amazing creamy background using the 600 at f4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really nice. The other thing I might suggest, Ken, is that you uh, darken the edges a little bit with the. I would, rather than just use like the vignette slider in Lightroom, maybe do more of a custom vignette that you can maybe do it a little bit off centered, and then brighten the area around the birds just a little bit more. Because if you look at your histogram, you have a lot of bright area on the right that's really not being utilized, and that'll just make it a lot more eye catching.
Yeah, so what David is saying, create a vignette, kind of like this, using the radial gradient, and then change your exposure a little bit so that you get more of that a vignette on that background. Which let's do an invert, and then we can do. You can see how we're bringing that darkness on the background while still retaining our the light on our subject as well by creating a vignette on our subject. And again, we have the vignette tool down in the develop module in Lightroom down at the bottom under effects. But the problem with this tool is that it creates a vignette centered on the image. And when your subjects are not centered, that tool doesn't work all that well. You can have a lot more control using the radial tool and then adjusting the exposure, for example, for that particular area, and you're able to create a vignette that's off center. And again, a very subtle effect. You don't want to do, some people may go a little overboard and do something like this, and that may be okay in certain situations. But to me, just a very slight effect is what we're aiming for. We're trying to enhance the image, not necessarily convert the image into something different. Okay, so Linda Sanders. Linda was actually down in Antarctica, I think just before we were, or basically around the same time. Linda's been with me in many workshops in the past, so I'm glad to see that she made it down there, and I hope she had better weather than we had when they were there. And this is kind of neat. These chin strap penguins, kind of cool interaction between these two. But there's a couple things here this image that kind of bother me a little bit. First off is a lot of this very thick snow coming down, and how it's creating these big blobs on our subject and in different areas that kind of detract and pull our eye into. One of the things that I was suggesting people do in a situation like this, when we had big snowflakes coming down, was actually trying to do a slow shutter, so that you do get the snow coming down in kind of little streaks, which don't produce these kind of big blobs in there, but actually give you a sense of more snow than what you're actually seeing out there, because you get these nice streaks coming down. Doesn't always work, as depends on the snow. The bigger the flakes, the better, and the slower the flakes are falling, the better. But you can do it, just experiment a little bit. I think you can be shooting at somewhere between like 1/20th of a second to 1/50th of a second will give you that nice look of those streaks of snow coming down. The other thing I want to point out is how you have this collision here. We talked about collisions and some of the other images that we looked at. That's always something you want to be looking at, is how the one subject may be impinging on another, or how one subject could be put against a background or a foreground element that may intersect it in a way that's not all that pleasant. And right here we have this going on between the background penguin and the foreground penguin. I like the interaction between them, but by just moving a tiny bit to the right, you may have been able to create a little separation between those two.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's, the more you photograph wildlife, the more you start noticing this stuff when you're in the field, and you can make those subtle adjustments when you have boots on the ground, because that's the time to fix it. If you just, like Juan said, had taken maybe 2 steps to your right, then that collision would have been avoided. But at the same time, there's other factors that you have to consider, because maybe if she had taken those 2 steps to the right, we may not see the feet of the background penguin, because it could be covered up by that rock.
Right.
And so there's lots of variables here. Obviously, it's easy to look at this when we're not there in the moment and say you should have done that.
Right.
But I do agree. I think that many snowflakes, I find it a bit too distracting. Even though I do like the interactions between those 2 penguins, I think that's fantastic. I would say this is one of those cases where the snow to me looks dingy. And there's room here that we could push those whites up, get it a little brighter. And the other thing I would probably do as well is just maybe get rid of some of the native lens vignetting, because with a real snowy image, I kind of like my edges to be a bit brighter. I don't like to see them all muted down. And sometimes I'll even take the vignette slider in Lightroom and just move it positive to even make the edges just a little bit more on the bright side. And then it kind of gives a better feeling of evenness, from center to edge.
Yeah, you saw. I don't know if you noticed that, guys. When I went here into the develop module, and then went to the vignette, and it did positive vignette. Oftentimes we do a negative vignette to get the darker edges, but oftentimes, especially when you have a high key image, having that positive vignette can actually look a lot more interesting and make the image kind of flow a little better. So that's something to think about. I do like, going back to some of the stuff that David said, I do like the setting here. I love these rocks. I love the location where these guys are. But I think, these 2 guys, there's too much of a collision there for me, for the image to feel comfortable. I love the interaction, but the fact that these 2 guys are so close together kind of detracts from the scene. Okay. Let's look at images from Melody. And Melody has sent us many images for the image review lives that we've done. And she is an avid bird photographer. She sends some amazing, outstanding bird image. And, she seems to favor bluebirds, eastern bluebirds, this is an eastern bluebird. And I love eastern bluebirds as well. And I love, she has this down pat about the nice out of focus backgrounds. She's shooting this at 6.3, long lens, a little further out, so it's giving you that nice out of focus background, nice creamy backgrounds. And she has them setting up on these incredibly beautiful berry bushes. But you see how this branch is coming down and really going behind our subject, and it's poking out from one side of the subject. So we have this branch coming out of the head and these berries coming out on the side. So one of the tricks when you're setting up, not sure if this was a setup, meaning that you had this branch out for the birds to come down to come and perch on it next to a feeder. But one of the things I would try to do is clean up these branches so that you do have good clean places for your birds to perch on, so that you don't run into these issues with these branches coming down behind and creating these collisions. Even this side, that's okay. That doesn't bother me as much, but the fact that this branch is kind of growing out of the head of our subject, and you got all these branches coming up back here, that's something you want to be paying attention to. I also, it's funny your compositional choices here. I think you could have moved up a little bit. The arching of this branch up here is a lot more interesting to me than this branch coming down. This branch looks like it's a broken branch, so it's not all that attractive. Whereas this arching branch up here, could be pretty neat. Could be a nice framing element. So if this was the setup, one of the things I would have done for cleaning up this perch is remove this branch and remove this branch. And then you'd have this nice open space for the birds to perch with a nice framing element in the background. And believe it or not, you can get birds to land here pretty easily. If you have this set up close to a food source, right, just off frame, they'll perch there as before they come in to eat from that feeder or that food source. And you can kind of encourage animals or birds to land where you want them to by providing a more open space. If you had a more open space here than you had over here, the bird would be more likely to land in this area than in this area as they're coming in to land on that feeder. So something to think about. Pay attention to those backgrounds. I know that you do a good job with that, Melody, and because of the images you provided in the past. So make sure you pay attention to that background and make sure that you clean that up a little bit. What do you think, David?
Yeah, you hit everything I noticed right off the bat too. It was just, yeah, I noticed the composition there and the collision with the background that was kind of difficult to work through in my head. And yeah, if we had that branch arcing above and kind of framing the whole image, it would really stand out. Technically, it's a great image. Low noise. I see you clean that up very well. The bird's pretty sharp. I do notice a little bit of topaz artifacts, especially around the edge of the body of the bird. And it looks like the focus hit primarily on the neck of the bird, and the head is just a little bit soft. I would probably prefer a little bit of selective sharpening around the eye region. But other than that, I think it's just a fantastic image. I like the subtle catch light in the eye. Yeah, it really helps you connect with the subject.
Yeah, I mean, these bluebirds are absolutely fantastic. They're just beautiful. I love the colors on them. And what's interesting about them, I'm not sure, when did you take this image, Melody? Let me take a look here. We can see when she took this. So this was just recent in November. The colors on these guys, they're highly variable, based on when they're breeding and when they're not. So this time of year, in late October, October 31st, their color are going to be a little bit more muted. And whereas in the spring, these blues and these rusty oranges in their chest going to be really, really vibrant and really beautiful. But that doesn't mean that you only shoot them during the spring. They are beautiful birds regardless of. But something to think about when you're out there and you're trying to create great images of these birds is think about their plumage and when their plumage is going to be at their peak. Okay, we have two more people and we have just over 10 minutes left. So I think we're only going to be able to do one pass on these images, and this is from Randy Proin. I'm probably totally butchering your last name. Sorry about that. And this is a great blue heron. And I started on the last one, so why don't you start with this one, David?
All right. So, yeah, once again, a great bird in flight moment here that you're able to capture. And I like, how you got both of the wings kind of expanded out, and you're able to get the bird's eyes nice and clear, looking in the right direction. You've got space in front of the bird. Just a couple things, to kind of point out. I can't see the settings on this one, but if you look on the right side of the image, you notice how the foot is cut off on the edge. And you always need to have a good amount of breathing room around your subject. And so you don't want anything colliding with the edge or just being too close to the edge such that it creates that visual tension. And then the other thing that I'm kind of noticing is it looks like there is like a lot of shadows being brought out. And I'm noticing some very odd coloration on the underside of the wings. And so that's usually a sign to me that the shadow slider was moved probably a bit too aggressively. And also it looks like there might be a bit too much vibrance being used. And vibrance as a slider, I think, is very overused in a lot of processing because the way vibrance works is it really adds color to places where there's not a lot of color to begin with. And so it can add color to places where they shouldn't have color, is kind of the take home message. So if you go crazy with that vibrance slider, sometimes it can create unwanted artifacts that aren't very visually appealing.
Yeah, I think that one of my challenges with this is, I mean, you nailed it right on the head. Is it feels a little bit over processed to me. The greens are a little too green, not the greens that we normally would see out in nature. They look a little bit too fluorescent, if you will. And we're seeing all these colors in the bottom of the bird that we typically do not see. They may be very subtle colors, but they're really hard to see. So by moving that shadow slider a little too far, that's what happens. You start getting these I want to say false colors, and they're not necessarily false colors, but they're false colors in the way that we see a great blue heron. You mentioned about not, making sure that you don't cut out any of the appendages of our subjects. The other thing I would think about is in this particular image, I would like to see more room at the top than at the bottom. Right now, it's really centered, and from the top of this wing to the top of the frame, and from the bottom of this wing to the bottom of the frame. So it's really centered. I would like to see that to have more room at the top than at the bottom, because we get the hint that this bird is just taking off from a perch. And the reason we know that is because these feet are kind of they're kicking off from a branch or something like that. So we're kind of expecting this bird to have an upward trajectory. So we want to have a little bit more room towards the top than at the bottom. I do see that we can't see the settings. We do have some motion blur up here, which is kind of nice, maybe a little more than I like to see. And we have these collisions with these branches, but it is what it is. The setting that you're in, this looks like a longleaf pine in the background that's merging with our great blue heron, but it's still a very nice dynamic action shot of a bird in flight. So, kudos for that, for capturing that. I do wonder, next time when you're submitting images, Ryan, it would be helpful to see the settings that you shot the image at. So make sure that those don't get stripped out when you export from whatever program you're using to process the image. Make sure that the settings stay intact so that we can see those when we import those into Lightroom on our end. Okay, and I think this is going to be our last one for the evening. And this is from Steve Nimzik. Steve and Linda were both together out in Antarctica, not on the same ship that we were in, a different ship, but approximately about the same time, maybe a little bit earlier than we were. And it does look like, by looking at the sky, that they did have some of those same gray skies that we had, David. Which is
The sun. What is
yeah.
it?
So, but that's a great opportunity to turn those images into black and whites, because it does add, much more sense of drama to the scene, which we may not have in a color image because of the kind of very even light and even skies. So I do like this composition a lot. I think that you did a great job, Steve, in bringing us in, making us feel like we're in at this location. And I like the nice tight crop on the right-hand side while focusing on these sort of jagged peaks over here. I like the amount of space you left at the bottom. I do looking at the sky, it just seems to have a little more texture than I expected to have. So that sky just looks a little bit, strange to me. What do you think, David?
It kind of does. Like the edges of the clouds are just a little too abrupt. I think I would like to see the sky be just a little softer. I don't know if there was some like clarity or something like that applied, but or if the highlights are brought down too much, that
Mm-hmm.
also creates the same thing because the highlight slider has clarity built into it,
Right.
and so it can kind of create those abrupt edge artifacts.
But yeah,
Then,
I do like the black and white conversion job that you did, Steve. I think you did a good job at it. Typically, whenever I see a
oh,
lot of
sorry,
folks doing
sorry,
a
Juan. I had pulled up a different image,
oh,
so
sorry.
I hadn't gone and looked at your eCam. So
Yeah.
my bad.
Oh, you were
You can
looking at
disregard
this
that
image with
comment
the
right there.
sun.
Yeah, I was looking at the sunny one.
Okay, no, we're looking at the black and white one.
Okay, sorry, my
So that's fine.
bad.
Go ahead, reset.
Reset. Okay, so yeah, if I'm looking at this one here, yeah, I agree. You know, I think those clouds, they just look a bit too modeled and unnatural. And that's usually a sign that there's been some degree of over processing. And so I try to look at some of the sliders. You know, what I like to do when I'm processing an image is I use the backslash key on my keyboard because that resets everything to 0. So I hold the backslash key, see where I started from, release the backslash key, see where I'm at. And
Right.
I look carefully to see, am I adding any artifacts? Am I making something look strange that shouldn't look strange? And that helps recalibrate my vision because when you're just sitting there processing away, you can get so accustomed to look at something that it could look atrocious and you think it looks fantastic.
Yeah, your eye just gets, I mean, your vision just gets so accustomed to what you're seeing, and especially when you're making these changes, little by little, and they're cumulative, so you don't get to see that. So doing absolutely using the backspace key, no, the backslash key, sorry, giving you the before and after view is very helpful. The other thing that I do oftentimes is, so right here to my left, I have a window. And when I'm working on an image, you know, after I've been working on the image for a little while, I'll take a rest from looking at the image and look outside, for my 15, 20 seconds or so that I can reset not just my vision and my perception of what I'm seeing, but it will also reset the white balance that my eyes have been, set to. Because oftentimes what happens with our eyes is that if there's a color cast in an image, our eyes kind of like adjust themselves, and we all of a sudden that color cast kind of disappears if you're not paying attention. So by looking outside, resetting my vision, and coming back and looking at the image, I can pick up on any color cast that may be there, or any, over processing that may have done. That first impression that you get when you look at the image can be very, very valuable in trying to figure out what you may have, what may be wrong with that image. It's a good sort of litmus test for me when I'm working on an image after a while, because your eye gets so used to what you're seeing, you may not see or may not appreciate the full extent of the edits that you're doing.
Yep. And so just a couple things that I'm noticing. First of all, this was shot at ISO 3200, which is getting pretty high for a landscape image because you really want to see a lot of detail. And the shutter speed was actually 1/4000th of a second, which is way too fast for a static subject. So we could have saved ourselves several stops of ISO, maybe shot this at like ISO 200 or 400, used a more reasonable shutter speed for a landscape, and then you would have a lot better detail and a lot less noise to contend with in post-processing. This was also shot at f20. And these mountains and everything, they're a good distance away from you. You don't really have a need for extreme depth of field here. You could have shot this at f8, which would be a much sharper aperture, and it would also save you, especially if you're in a low light situation, it'd also help you with the hand holding that you probably had to do. And so those would be a couple of my suggestions right there. Just mind those settings, especially if you're in like a wildlife shooting mode, you have to kind of revert in your mind to go into a landscape shooting mode and then back to wildlife or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, 4,000 of a second is definitely a little excessive for this. Even if you're in a moving ship, or even if you're in a bobbing Zodiac, you don't need to be that fast for a static subject like this. You may want to be a little higher, and you're shooting at 109 millimeters. So, 500th of a second, that would have been more than enough, or even 800th of a second, 600, 640. Any of those would have been enough, even if you were kind of in a more, less stable environment. That 4,000th of a second is really, you're paying for it on that high ISO. So you could have had more dynamic range, more detail, and more room to edit the image in if you had a lower ISO.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's it for this episode of Image Review Live. Thanks, David, for joining us on this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it and that everybody got something out of it, and a little different perspective and opinion than the one that we normally do between Jaclyn and I. Not that Not that Jaclyn does a bad job or anything, not at all, Jaclyn. I know she's listening, but it's always good to have another voice, another opinion in here, especially since we have so many repeat folks joining in on us on the Image Review Live.
All right, thanks so much, guys. It was fun to look at your images. Great work.
Absolutely. Thanks again for everybody for submitting your images. And Jaclyn is those of you can't hear her. She is texting me furiously, asking me to mention to folks that may be interesting. We do have a few kind of openings that are coming up on some of the workshops earlier in the year, earlier next year. We have an opening for that just happened very recently for winter in Yellowstone, January 16th through 24th. We have one opening for that. We have 3 openings, including the Master Suite on the Alaska Inside Passage workshop. That's in April. And then we have one shared mail cabin on the Botswana trip on May 29th to June 12th. So if any of those interest you, make sure to check out the website and let us know if you have any questions. But hopefully we'll get to see you in one of those. Thanks, David, for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you again sometime soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Take care, folks. Thanks a bunch. Bye, Jaclyn.